I was not supposed to talk about it at first. That was the whole point. Keep the trouble quiet, scrub it out with polite emails, two-sentence minutes, and the occasional friendly reminder flyer tucked under a beige storm door. We pride ourselves in modesty here on Maple Ridge Lane. The houses painted soft creams, the hydrangeas fussy enough to be DLC for a movie set. I lived on the corner, third house from the cul-de-sac, which meant I got to watch everything happen like the person in the kitchen with the perfect vantage point, hands in dishwater, ears tuned to gossip like a cheap radio. My name's not important for the record, but if you must know, call me someone who stayed too long, someone who had an opinion and learned when to hide it. It began one spring with paint. True story. Derek Alvarez, who everyone thought was a harmless, perpetually exhausted dad, decided to repaint his driveway. Not the house, not the trim, the driveway. He chose a dark slate gray, tasteful in his head, practical in his defense. In our HOA bylaws, there's an aesthetic clause, intentionally vague, written by people who like the sound of uniformity on paper. Someone on the board, Marla Jennings, who waters her hydrangeas like a ritual and reads the bylaws as scripture, saw it and saw red. To her, it was a moral failing. To Derek, it was a personal improvement. To me, it was the first crack. I remember the email Marla sent, subject line in all caps, violation, driveway color. It was sharp, sanctimonious, and included a photo that made the dark gray look like an affront. Derek answered with a flippant quip about color police, and I could feel the future snapping into place. Meetings, petitions, neighbor alliances assembled like old friends at a funeral. We weren't supposed to be dramatic. We were supposed to sign off on pool fundraisers and tolerate each other's holiday lights. But paint has a way of unraveling decent people. And the underrated thing about small towns, and I'm calling our lane small, is that everything becomes about someone else. You pick a color and suddenly you're a statement. People took sides like they were auditioning for an opera. I watched the first week as subtle things changed. Marla stopped smiling when she passed Derek on morning runs. A Tupperware of lemon bars left as peace offering by Derek's wife vanished from the HOA fridge. A neighborhood app thread flowered into a battalion of opinions. The garden, where we'd all planted mint and tomatoes the previous summer, started to feel like a jury box. That summer, the hydrangeas were lovely and false, heavy with water and politics. I didn't say much, I was cataloging. The first official HOA meeting after the driveway incident felt like the overture to something larger. We meet in the community room by the pool. Cheap chairs, a whiteboard with dry erase markers mysteriously missing their caps, and a long table that collects gossip like dust. It was the kind of room that smelled faintly of chlorine and moral superiority. Marla arrived with a legal pad, those red reading glasses perched on her head like a crown. Derek came in late with a baseball cap that said "nothing to see here," and you could tell he was trying to laugh through it. I sat by the window, pretending to check the agenda when really I was watching faces. The meeting starts with the usual dribble: pool heater costs, the annual picnic, who's bringing coleslaw, a vote to remind everyone about trash can placement on trash day. Then Marla brought up the driveway. She didn't present it as a complaint about aesthetics. She positioned it like a civic duty. "There's an expectation we uphold," she intoned. and you could see some people nod because they were scared to be the only one who didn't. I watched Derek's jaw tighten. I've seen that jaw tighten before when he's trying to seem innocent. He said he'd had a resurfacing company recommend the color because it would reduce glare for his aging mother. It was a small, careful story. Marla asked for a motion to enforce the clause, a motion that would require Derek to change it or face fines. That's when people began to pick roles. My neighbor Carol went full prosecutor, citing quote, precedent. Old Mr. Haynes, who keeps his yard like a museum, muttered about slippery slopes and how, if we ignore this, then what next? The young couple across the street, Lila and Jonah, sat awkwardly, sticky with the discomfort of people getting older every day, serious about things they haven't yet learned to feel strongly about. I remember Marla's face then, the way victory flickered in her eyes, as if this were more than a driveway, as if riding herd on a color was actually important. Derek, looking like a man who had just had a neighbor insult his taste and his mother, said he'd prefer to compromise but didn't see why paint should be legislated. The vote was close. I don't remember the numbers exactly. Those small official things tend to blur. What I do remember is how sudden a private battle can turn public. Someone suggested mediation. Someone else suggested a fine schedule. It landed on a recommendation for a repainting within 60 days. A nebulous sentence that sounded firm and then evaporated like fog. That night my phone buzzed with texts, half jokes, half commands. "Are we really doing this?" one asked. "They painted a driveway." Another replied, "But we were not just doing it. We were teetering into that strange communal hunger for being right, which, I've decided, is worse than being rich or successful in small towns. Being right buys you an identity and sometimes a grudge." And the hydrangeas outside the meeting room looked like witnesses, patient and blue. After the meeting, the emails multiplied. Every time someone hit reply all, it was like adding another match to a dry pile. I felt myself sucked into the orbit because gossip isn't a hobby on Maple Ridge Lane. It's a currency. Marla's notes were formal, heavy with citations from bylaws no one recalled voting on. Derek sent a passive-aggressive message about community standards and family needs that read like it had been drafted by a PR person who loved his mother. But the messages under the thin veneer of civility were where the truth hid. Lines like, "If Derek loves his mother, perhaps he'll respect others," investment in common appearance, loaded, yes, and clever in its cruelty. The garden committee became the battlefield. That small rectangular plot behind the clubhouse had been our attempt at a communal joy. Tomatoes, basil, a shared trellis that tasted of adolescence and kindness. Someone, perhaps because they were tired of triage in meetings, started locking the garden gate at night. It felt like petty security theater until a whole dynasty of petty theft accusations started. Someone claimed their herbs had been clipped without permission. Another said a tomato plant had been uprooted. The accused? Derek's son, whom neighbors half knew. Derek swore his kid wouldn't do such a thing and offered to repair any damage. Marla replied with a note suggesting, quote, proactive surveillance. It read like an invitation to escalate. I confess, I put up the cheap, motion-activated camera by the garden gate Because my curiosity is a personal failing, I told myself it was for evidence, for clarity. In truth, it was because I wanted to see faces. I wanted to know if our neighbors would look like predators or victims. The camera caught Mrs. Lockwood, who waters her azaleas with religious fervor, sneaking in to retrieve a pot she'd forgotten to bring home. It showed teenage kids with dirt under their nails, laughing, not guilty in the way of animals. It showed Derek's son once, trailing a wheelbarrow loaded with compost, head bowed like a kid doing chores. It showed me the smallness of what we were arguing over. I posted a blurred screenshot on the neighborhood app with a caption that was equal parts shrill and earnest. Community garden respect, please. That post was the small stone that created ripples. People chose sides, as if a picture of someone's back could be translated into a moral alignment test. Some supported me. Finally, some accountability. Some accused me of spying. And amid this, a new thread opened about who has the right to judge common property. The language we used toggled between civic duty and personal attack, and I could smell the subtle shift. Rules were no longer about order. They were about exclusion. When things escalate around here, they don't do it with violence or dramatic fistfights. They escalate with paperwork, with petitions and invoices, and the sudden appearance of people who say they represent the community. One afternoon, I found a notarized letter in my mailbox endorsing Marla's enforcement actions and signed by 3 homeowners I'd barely seen since the HOA picnic. It was the kind of legal-sounding thing that makes people do strange, defensive things, like printing signs or forming alliances. Derek printed an opposing flyer. Freedom to improve, it said, and pictures of driveways before and after, like a home improvement catalog. The flyers went on lampposts and under storm doors, and like a virus, in the space between courteous living and raw feeling, they spread. At the next HOA meeting, the community room was more full than normal. People showed up who usually only came around for the holiday lights vote. We had new faces with firm voices, and one of them, a man named Alan with a tie that looked imported, actually proposed a clause for limited driveway color variants under compassionate grounds. It sounded reasonable, and perhaps it was, but in that room everything reasonable took a sharp left into personal history. Someone said compassionate grounds could be used as a shield for people who didn't want to follow common standards, and that it would open a floodgate. Another asked whether relaxing rules might lead to someone painting their whole house fluorescent orange, which is the exact kind of slippery slope mental image that wins arguments. Derek came with a list of signatures collected door to door from people who liked the gray and didn't see the harm. Marla came with a binder, tidy and thick, filled with photos she'd taken of other violations, e.g., a mailbox with a sticker and a holiday wreath that didn't meet specified dimensions. The meeting turned into a duel of documents. The moderator, our appointed neighbor who taught community college, tried to maintain order. I sat there, fingers tapping, recognizing the pattern. Once we shift from conversation to paperwork, the humanity leaves the room. It's an odd, sad kind of algebra. Once you quantify someone, you can subtract their dignity. After the meeting, a group of us lingered, and the conversation became more intimate, more venomous. Marla admitted, in a way that was almost apologetic, that she'd lost her father the previous year and that keeping the neighborhood right felt like holding to something solid. It was the first time I saw the human nucleus under her sternness. Derek said he'd only wanted the driveway to be safer for his mother, that the glare from old concrete made mornings difficult. Both confessions landed with a weight in my chest. For a hot second, the fight didn't look like a duel. It looked like two people trying to find a way to grieve. But the crowd wants resolution, not nuance. And our neighborhood likes rules, because rules are simpler than feelings. The petty revenge started small and precise, like good quilting. People send each other anonymous notes. Someone measured the distance of Marla's mailbox from the curb and left a ruler propped against it with a post-it that read check. Derek's children came home to find the bike they'd left in the driveway tipped over as if by a ghost. No one claimed responsibility for these acts. That's part of the point. Anonymity is currency. Meanwhile, the garden gate, impossibly, developed a squeak. Someone greased it at night, and then loosened it again so that it sang a high, accusing note whenever it was opened. Sometimes I think people enjoy the sound because it is a small soundtrack for righteous indignation. What really broke my heart was the way friendships began to dissolve over trivialities. Lila, who used to bring over a casserole and gossip about the PTA, stopped turning up for our coffee mornings. She said she felt caught in the crossfire. Jonah started answering texts curtly, and then not at all, like a person who decided silence was safety. Carol and Mrs. Lockwood, who once hosted a neighborhood book and bake club, now sat on different sides of the table at HOA meetings like allies at a summit. Even my kitchen felt political, dishes stacked like quiet ballots. I tried to be neutral, which in this environment is interpreted as cowardice or duplicity, depending on who you're talking to. Then someone intentionally trampled a row of Marla's front hydrangeas at night. Not enough to kill them, but enough to bruise. The next morning she posted a picture on the community app, a close-up of crushed petals, and an accusation that measured like a scalpel. This is not an accident. She posted a list of possible culprits and included a coy line about those who disagree with standards. People replied with outrage or sympathy. Derek commented, "We should be better than this," which read like a plea and an indictment. The garden became not a plot of soil but a line on a map, a border between camps. I felt sick. I considered telling the board about my camera footage. I considered confessing it had been me who put the camera there. Instead, I did nothing. Doing nothing is its own act in a neighborhood like ours. It's like letting a bruise breathe. Sometimes it heals, sometimes it turns into something worse. The hydrangeas limped on, bruised and beautiful, and I realized the way we mistreat shared things tells us how fragile our civility really is. There was one afternoon, ordinary until it wasn't, when a letter came to everyone's mailbox promising an independent mediator who would help settle the driveway garden feud. The flyer included a smiling photo of a woman named Elise and a little blurb about restorative community practices. It felt like a fresh coat of paint on a scandal. People wanted the drama to end as much as they wanted to be proven right. A lot of us signed up, not because we trusted miracles, but because we were tired of watching our neighbors through the lens of petty grievances. The mediation meeting was arranged in a school gym that smelled of varnished wood and old sweat. We sat in a circle like amateurs at a support group. Elise had that calm, weary look of someone who'd spent years coaxing people off of cliff edges. She asked each of us to speak without interruption. That rule, we discovered, has the power to make people honest because it takes away the luxury of immediate retort. When it was Marla's turn, she explained, not in bylaws speak but in human speech, how the bylaws were her way of holding on to order after her father's passing. She admitted she'd started enforcing rules harder because it made the world predictable. People in the circle nodded. You could see the gears turning to interpret her as needing empathy. Derek's turn was quieter. He talked about mornings with his mother and the fear that the glare from his old driveway would make her fall. He said he chose the darker gray to be practical, not defiant. He admitted to feeling judged and, for the first time in public, apologized for the tone of his emails. The grand revelation of the session, for me, was not the truth about driveways, but the human logic behind our small, vicious acts. We weren't monsters. We were frightened people pressing rules like bandages over aching spots. But there was also a confession that nobody expected. Someone, not Derek, not Marla, admitted they'd been secretly replacing plants in the community garden with different varieties to improve the aesthetic. It was petty, childish, and quietly malicious. The group laughed, but it was a brittle laugh. Elise encouraged us to find a practical solution, a written, specific variance process for driveway colors, and a shared schedule for garden use. Details were promised, signatures were exchanged, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe ordinary decency could be re-established with forms and commitments. We walked out of the gym feeling like we'd done something substantial. Back on Maple Ridge Lane, the evening was soft and forgiving. Someone lit tiki torches at a barbecue. Kids rode bikes in the cul-de-sac like blissful, oblivious metaphors for hope. I texted a friend, "Maybe this will calm down," and got back a shrugged emoji. The next morning, a new anonymous note appeared, stapled to the community bulletin board. Trust, not paperwork. It felt like a threat that was also an invitation. I began to understand that agreements, even well-intentioned ones, can't mend the small splinters in a neighborly relation overnight. The paper solutions had been signed and filed, but rigs have a way of slipping. The variance process required homeowners to submit applications with swatches and justifications. Derek filled his out politely, handed in color samples, and waited. The board, led by Marla, took more time than necessary. I watched as the approval process became a new theater for power. Meetings glowed on the calendar like threat points. The hours were long and dull, specifically the ones where civility hides behind minutes and the phrase, "table for further review." There was a particular Monday when the tension felt too heavy to bear, a hum in the air like an oncoming storm. A neighbor, Thomas, who keeps birds and opinions in equal measure, called a press-style Q&A session in the cul-de-sac. "We should be transparent about timelines," he said, and someone in the back muttered that we'd all become tedious. Petty acts increased, as if people were trying to make the other side flinch. A bag of dog waste appeared on a garden bench with a post-it that read, "For inconsideration." Another morning, someone had painted a small mocking stripe of fluorescent orange at the end of Derek's driveway. Not enough to be a protest piece, but enough to sting. I crossed paths with Derek during one of these fraught afternoons. He was carrying a bag of soil mixes from the hardware store, like a man who was offering his hands to something useful. He looked tired. Not just tired of the fight, but exhausted by the realization that his home had been turned into a battleground. "I didn't think they'd treat it like this," he told me. He didn't say fight. He used a softer word like matter. And that made it worse because, in a dispute, we clean language everything to make it bearable. I told him I'd seen the orange stripe and that it was juvenile. He laughed, small and brittle, and said, "Do you think they'll ever stop?" I didn't have a good answer. At the hearing where the board finally decided to accept Derek's variance with immediate conditions, reflectivity tests, a trial 6-month period, a community inspection, the room was tense and brittle. Some cheered the compromise. Others grumbled about special favors. That phrase, special favors, is flexible and dangerous. It sticks like burrs in conversation and never fully washes out. We thought the decision would end the conflict, and for a week it did. Birds returned to nests, people touched grass. But we forget that victory leaves residue. It asks for allegiance. Derek's acceptance felt like a fragile truce, not a resolution. And the deeper truth was, everyone wanted to be the one who had been proved right. The truce was, of course, a temporary thing. People don't easily forgive. They either forget or they build a shrine to their memory and invite everyone over. The garden committee had been reshuffled under the pretense of fresh perspectives. New members came in, faces I didn't know, earnest and unreadable. One of them, a woman named Paige, proposed an after-hours quiet policy that curiously coincided with when Derek's son practiced skateboarding. Coincidence or design? In small neighborhoods, you learn that coincidences are often curated. Then there was the hymn of escalation. Anonymous neighborhood watch flyers appeared warning about outsiders and unapproved modifications. The language was coded but clear. It was a pivot from policy to protectionism, and you could see the seams. Marla's supporters started to conflate compliance with character. Derek's supporters argued for empathy over enforcement. The app lit up at all hours with commentary that used to be saved for private dinner tables. I found myself thinking about how easy it is to confuse civic order with personal superiority. On a humid afternoon, the worst small betrayal happened. Someone, and we never officially confirmed who, planted a hydrangea in Derek's yard with a small handwritten note pegged to it. From the community. On it was a single line, "We like our view unchanged." Derek uprooted it in silence and threw it in his trash. When I saw the trash can later, the plant lay there like an accusation. That image stuck with me longer than any angry email. It was a physical manifestation of what we'd been doing with words, inserting judgment into people's lives. There was, too, the subtle theft of trust. People stopped borrowing tools. They left packages at porches and watched from windows like sentries. The things that had bound us, shared recipes, the casual babysitting, the loaned ladders, frayed. I caught myself calculating which neighbors I'd admit into my house if my pipes froze at 2 a.m. The answer had become complicated. Derek called me once and asked, quietly, if he could keep a spare key to my shed in case his mother needed a walker. It felt like a small kindness, and in that request was the bright, soft question, "Are we still neighbors?" Then the unfortunate thing happened, a complaint about holiday lights. It's absurd when you say it out loud, the great collision over Christmas bulbs. But this is how our neighborhood escalates. Something silly becomes symbolic. Marla, who used to be reasonable in other ways, sent a terse reminder about light heights and timers that made the whole street feel as if we were being judged by an invisible panel of elders. Derek had put up tasteful warm lights and a single set of cool white lights along his newly darker driveway for visibility. Someone complained they'd been left on too long. The complaint read less like a technical objection and more like a moral indictment. Excessive, it said, which in our town equates to show off. Derek's reply was a plea about safety. He explained that his mother woke early and walked at sunrise. The light made it safer for her steps. That should have been the end of it, a simple accommodation. Instead, people started swapping stories. Who remembers when someone's father tripped on the walkway? Who remembers a neighbor leaving a porch light on for a week after an emergency? These small recollections became moral data points in an argument that had gone so far it needed plot lines. Suddenly, history stacked against Derek. At a potluck that evening, conversation below the surface turned to the idea of representation. A couple mentioned they'd been at the HOA meeting where Derek got the variance. They said they felt excluded from the process. Exclusion is a powerful word in a small town. It sounds like conspiracy, because it often feels like one person has been given a seat at the table while others were left scribbling notes. Marla, who had complained about exclusion in her own rhetoric, was now towering into that position herself, and people noticed. We all have a moment where we see our own contradictions reflected back at us, and it hurts. Hers was on display, and I could tell she didn't love the look. That night, someone chalked a mocking variance across Derek's driveway in white, primary-colored chalk, the kind you use for children's hopscotch. It was juvenile, petty, and cruel in an innocent way. Derek hosed it off in the morning without a word, but his face made me want to reach across the years and smooth his forehead. The thing that I finally realized, and admit with embarrassment, is that by the time people begin to use humor as a weapon in public spaces, they've stopped seeing each other as friends. Humor should heal. Here, it functioned as a scalpel. It was the kids who did something that finally broke whatever remained of our pretended normalcy. One warm evening, a group of teenagers, the sort that skateboards and tells their parents they're just out, erected a makeshift ramp at the end of the cul-de-sac. They practiced flips and laughter and the sound of rubber on pavement. It was vibrant noise, a sound our community had outsourced to youthful energy and tolerated with a wary smile. They practiced late into the evening one night, the way young people do, testing limits and patience. Someone called it in. The complaint was terse, unapproved noise after dark. There was an implication that the teens were disturbing the peace, which in our lane translates to reminding us we are getting old. A board member arrived with the pastoral zeal of someone carrying rules like torches. The kids scattered. Then, in an act that felt both tactical and cruel, someone with a key to the clubhouse emptied out the supply of folding chairs into the cul-de-sac and left them in a neat line with a sign, HOA property, do not use. It was cold and theatrical. In response, the teens who had been infantilized by the complaint pulled a prank that was more symbolic than destructive. They spray-painted the curb in front of Marla's house with small flowers and the initials FYI, as if to say, for your information, you're on notice. The next morning Marla found the paint. It wasn't much, just a few bright blobs, but to her it was an invasion. She called for a special session with zero tolerance for vandalism. And the tone shifted again. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about driveways or garden etiquette. It was about the boundaries of acceptable expression within our gated little microcosm. What really makes small communities fragile is that we recycle resentment. When someone is called out as a role, enforcer, victim, clown, it sticks. The kids' prank stuck to the teens like paint to clothes. Parents came to the meeting, faces flushed with shame and anger, and asked for leniency. They didn't mean anything by it, they said, because it's painful to imagine your kid as an antagonist in the adult world, and yet the prank had meaning beyond childish mischief. It was an attempt to reclaim a small public space, and an angry, adolescent brand of commentary on our adult sensibilities. The paint faded in a week. The sentiment did not. There was a night when I sat at my kitchen table, the radio low, and considered packing a box with a few dishes and moving to the kind of place where no one knows your mailbox's exact dimensions. But nostalgia and a stubbornness rooted in small-town loyalty kept me. Besides, leaving doesn't feel like winning. Instead, I found myself going to the board's informal gathering at the community room one Tuesday, because someone floated the idea of restorative circles again. People were tired, and sometimes the language of healing is simply what people default to when angry words have been exhausted. At the meeting, a new person spoke up, Rachel, who runs the local nonprofit that does mediation in high schools. She suggested a transparent restitution process. The idea was not revolutionary: apologize, repair, and agree to community service like tending the garden. Marla was skeptical but curious. Derek looked like a man who wanted peace but didn't want to seem weak. I offered, in a burst of unintended bravery, to host one of the circles in my living room. If you had asked me years earlier if I'd house a community intervention, I would have laughed. But by then, the street's loneliness had grown heavy enough that an offer to host felt like a small, practical thing to do. We gathered, a small, motley crew of people who had once found each other charming. It started with food. Someone made chili, another brought bread, and the atmosphere thawed a little. We sat, and each person said something like, "I feel," or "I remember." It was vulnerable and clumsy. At one point, Marla admitted she'd been unfairly severe because she feared losing handholds on life after losing her father. Derek said he'd been defensive because he felt his mother's safety had been dismissed. People apologized. We decided some reparations. Derek would host a safety workshop for the elderly. Marla would donate a year's worth of garden supplies to a youth program. The kids would repaint curbs under supervision. It was practical and symbolic. For a few weeks there was a fragile truce. People smiled with the cautiousness of those who have forgiven but not forgotten. At the community garden, something remarkable happened. People actually planted together. We shared tools instead of accusations. Someone taught a teen how to prune roses properly. Small acts of cooperation are powerful because they rebuild trust in unexpected ways. I remember the afternoon we all sat on folding chairs eating cold pizza and comparing notes about how long it's reasonable to keep porch lights on. It was almost funny, and that made it tender. It convinced me, briefly, that people can be better than their worst moments. Then came the leak. the small, bureaucratic kind that reveals who we are. Someone, possibly in an attempt to protect transparency, posted the minutes of a private board email thread on the neighborhood app. The message included opinions about problem households and suggested fines in a tone bordering on contempt. It read like a soap opera's most unpleasant episode where people you know are reduced to archetypes. The leak made private frustrations public, and the effect was immediate. People felt betrayed. You could see it in faces at the post office, in the way the mail carrier lingered an extra beat. Privacy in this place is a fragile thing. We don't have curtains thick enough to block out small cruelties. Marla accused Derek of orchestrating the leak. Derek, predictably, denied it, sounding wounded in a way that made even his denials seem like confessions. Friends picked sides, and some of those friendships were brittle enough they cracked. I had to choose, which is to say, I found myself speaking to people in a way that assumed allegiances mattered more than reconciliation. Somewhere in those heated exchanges, I realized that the neighborhood had become less about shared spaces and more like a faction, with each member trying to convince others of their moral standing. In the days that followed, people started to quietly shop their stories to each other, small, curated versions meant to sway opinions. It's astonishing how quickly facts become narratives, and narratives become weapons. A rumored phone call between Marla and the out-of-town property manager was retold as suspicious collusion. Derek's late-night porch calls were recounted as secret strategy sessions. The truth is kinder and duller. Sleep-deprived neighbors, concerned relatives, petty rivalries. But we preferred the theatrics. I confess to feeding some of it. To gossip being my national pastime, I admit I'm complicit in the mess. That was another turning point for me. Recognizing my own appetite for drama as part of the problem. For all our dramas about rules and light, the leak pointed to a deeper rot. We had stopped treating each other as people whose complexity mattered. Instead, we curated identities to confirm our feelings. I started avoiding public spaces on purpose, not out of fear, but because I was ashamed. The lane had become a mirror where everyone examined themselves and decided they didn't like the reflection. The rupture reached what felt like a small crescendo when the HOA called an emergency meeting under the procedural cloak of discussing the leak. The turnout was the largest I'd ever seen. People filled every chair and stood along the walls like a chorus waiting to be judged. Marla arrived in her usual crisp outfit, but with a line of fatigue I hadn't noticed before. Derek looked resigned in a way that was almost noble. We all knew this meeting would decide whether we repaired the social fabric or kept picking at it. A proposal came forward, a suggestion for a citizens' review board to oversee sensitive board communications. It sounded bureaucratic and tedious, but it was also a chance to create a buffer between personal anger and official action. Arguments ran predictably. Some thought it would be a needless layer of administration. Others saw it as necessary reform. I found myself voting for the review board because I'd reached a point where process felt like a balm. We agreed to it with conditions for transparency, privacy, and accountability. Then came the unexpected. A woman named Gloria rose from the back and told a story about her son who'd come out months earlier and had faced a neighbor's cruel remark. She connected that cruelty to the broader climate of our lane. When we think it's okay to judge someone's driveway color, we make a place safe to judge other things, she said, and a hush fell because she had named the pattern out loud. It was as if she'd taken the mirror we'd all been avoiding and held it up. People shifted in their seats. Some looked ashamed, some angry. We were being asked to take moral inventory, and that hurts. After the meeting, there was a remarkable thing. A group of neighbors, Marla included, went down to Derek's house and helped him plant low-glare ground cover and install proper lighting for his mother. They did it almost in silence, shovels hitting soil, apologies stitched into the work. It felt like a small act of repair that might hold. I watched from my window and cried, surprise and relief mixing like rain. That night, a sense of quiet possibility returned for a moment. The idea we could change, just a bit, was possible. Months passed, and the lane slowly rearranged itself. Some friendships were permanently altered. A few people moved away, tired of the emotional bookkeeping. The review board implemented its guidelines and waded through disputes like a patient judge. The garden recovered and even thrived. We added a small plaque that read, "Shared hands, shared harvest." A bit pompous but true. The hydrangeas regained their color. Neighbors waved again. It was not perfect. There are scars that never entirely smooth out. People still grumbled about each other's pruning choices. Holiday lights still became symbolic. But there was a measure of restraint now, a sense that our small, fraught lives were better preserved under a shared responsibility rather than individual fury. One night, months after the worst of it, I sat on my stoop and watched Derek help his mother across her front yard. She stepped carefully, the darker driveway working as he'd hoped, and he was gentle, fussing with a blanket across her knees. Marla walked by with a grocery bag and paused to chat for a moment about a shared recipe. It was the mundane intimacy of neighbors who'd been through something ugly and come out on the other side with some small humility. We said polite things and they were honest, and that honesty felt like a fragile treasure. I still think about the people who broke confidences, who let fear push them into petty cruelty. I think about the fact that many of our worst acts were excuses to avoid our grief or our boredom. But I also think about the times when people re-apologized, when they returned plants to hurtful places and mended fences with actual hammers. There was no grand redemption, no triumphant return to some golden age of neighborliness. Instead, there was a slow, practical mending, a repaired gate, a clarified clause, a shared compost bucket. These are not romantic acts. They are the work of people choosing to persist together. In the end, what I learned, and what still gives me pause as I water my own hydrangeas on warm mornings, is that small communities are constant negotiations between the need to be correct and the need to be kind. We flail when we're afraid. We enforce rules when we're hurting. The hydrangea war, as people now jokingly call it at the annual picnic, was less about color and more about how we choose to be in relation. I think about Marlo watering her plants like rites of penance, and Derek quietly hauling compost like daily prayer. Both of them, in their own ways, wanted to keep their world from tipping. Sometimes, late at night, I reread the old message threads that I saved, like some anthropologist of small disasters, and I wince at the language we used, the certainties, the moralizing. But then I remember the repair, the neighbor who showed up with a ladder, the teens repainting curbs after community service, Marla and Derek sharing coffee on a porch after a meeting. Those moments mattered more than the email wars ever did. They were not flashy, they were the opposite. They were steady and small and stubbornly human. If you ask me today if I'd trade Maple Ridge Lane for somewhere less complicated, I'd hesitate. The trouble lives in the ordinary places worth saving, the dull bylaws and the messy human impulses. We learned that rules can be both shield and sword, that empathy is often messy and inconvenient, and that sometimes saving a neighborhood just means being willing to sit across from someone whose choices you dislike and listen until you're tired. We taught ourselves to do that, awkwardly and imperfectly. The hydrangeas still bloom blue each season, and when I see them, I'm reminded of everything. The petty grievances and the small, brave reconciliations that stitched us back together. The cost of drama is real, and we paid it, but the other cost of leaving would have been worse. So we stayed, we apologized, we watered, and quietly, that is how we became neighbors again.